Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to Food for the Heart, our Friday night interactive church with Abide.Network. Now, if any of you have gone to that website, Abide.Network, you can donate to us. And I know it's a time of year that everybody's asking for donations. So think about what you're able and just realize that we are a live group of people doing coaching, doing counseling, doing prayer intervention for one another, very active. And so anything that you offer is helps sustain. And so thanks for sharing that screen, Cree. Appreciate that. Okay, so I just want to tell you after I introduce Anne Marie, I'm going to have our friend Debbie pray. But I just want to tell you that Anne Marie I'm thrilled to meet her tonight because she has been a prayer warrior for me. She's meant a lot to me. I was struggling with a lot of the estrangement issue and the empty nest first, and then this long stretch of when is this going to turn around, and actually I didn't know when it would, but last night it did for me. My daughter and I spent hours talking. She slept over, and it was like, how long did I pray for that? I want to thank you, Anne Marie, because you give people hope who wonder how long and what can they do and what can they say. And so this is personal, what you're sharing tonight, personal to me, personal to many of you. And some of you have young kids and you don't have that yet, but this is going to help you to understand the way of free will and the kind of bond that you can create right now. So let me tell you a little bit about Anne Marie. She collaborates with her husband, Eric, in pastoral and family ministries. And I'm a witness to that because she has called me and prayed for me. And this December, they'll be celebrating their 35th wedding anniversary. Man, you don't look old enough. What were you, 10 when you got married? No. Anne Marie holds a degree in music, and she's a professional singer and voice teacher. Oh, how nice. I wish she lived near me. She's working toward her Abide certification, which is something I've done, and it is worth all the effort. Now she'll be speaking tonight, as we said before, on parental estrangement. So Anne Marie and her husband have 4 estranged adult children and 3 grandchildren they have not yet met. So this is really a personal topic for her. And the title of her talk tonight is Recovering from the Pain of Parental Estrangement. And what did people say about estrangement? Well, she'll be telling us more. I don't need to read all of that, but she has some wonderful writers that she'll be quoting and explaining their statistics, their research, and knowing that we're not alone. Statistics doesn't mean anything until you go, oh, this is happening to other people. I'm not alone. So welcome, Anne Marie. We're going to open with prayer from Debbie.
Dear Lord, we come to you tonight with hearts full of gratitude, but also with pains in many of our hearts, and especially the pain of estrangement, which we are going to talk about tonight. And I pray that you will bless Anne Marie as she shares her thoughts with us, that you have led her. And we thank you that she is willing to do this when she is still coming from a place of pain for herself. Lord, help us to remember as we listen tonight that we can share and bless others even when we are in the midst of our valley of trouble. We do not have to wait to come through it. So speak to us, we pray, and draw us close to you and heal our relationships with each other. Amen.
Amen. Perfect prayer. Okay, welcome, Anne Marie.
Thank you. And I'm sorry, was that Debbie who prayed? Is that the
Yes.
name?
Yes.
Okay. for that prayer. I really appreciate that. And yes, this is my first time actually speaking on this topic. And we are 5 years into our own estrangement, so it is still relatively fresh for us. I appreciate Jennifer asking me to share with you guys. So yeah, this is not a past issue for us. We're currently living in it. In 2019, we lost our three younger children to an estrangement that was orchestrated by a third party and our eldest son. And the way it happened was just one at a time over a period of about 8 months. And we were completely bewildered, didn't know what was happening behind the scenes until much later. So I won't be going into our personal story for a few reasons. One is to protect the privacy of my kids. But I have learned a lot over the past 5 years about estrangement. And I have to say that initially, there was a lot of shame attached to it for me, and I wanted to keep it very private. Unfortunately, my children were very public with it, so there was no way to do that. But it's a common response to want to hide what's happening and not disclose. And that's one of the reasons why I feel compelled to share, even though this is really difficult for me to do, is because I know a lot of people are suffering in silence and afraid to talk about this. So let's just define estrangement. Let's talk about the Cornell Reconciliation Project. Karl Pillemer is a sociologist and gerontologist who works for Cornell University. And he noticed that this was a common theme that he was beginning to hear more and more, was these divisions, these estrangements, family members not speaking to each other. And so he wondered just how common this was, and he began what he dubbed the Cornell Reconciliation Project, which was the first national survey on estrangement in the US. And they discovered through this survey that 27% of Americans are estranged from a family member. And when they say estranged, for the purposes of this particular survey, this is no contact at all. So estrangement can be much broader than that. It can be very limited contact. But just for the sake of this survey, it was no contact at all. And the number is still as high as 27%. And 10% of parents and adult children report being estranged. Again, that's zero contact whatsoever. The numbers are likely much higher when you broaden the basket, so to speak, to include those who have minimal contact. And when you account for those who may be reluctant to share that they are estranged. In addition to that, the COVID lockdowns took place after this survey was done, and many adult children used the COVID lockdowns as sort of a test period. We suspect that the numbers for estrangement actually increased quite a bit during the COVID lockdowns. Joshua Coleman, I wanted to reiterate too what I had included in the written thing that I sent in, that Karl Pillemer refers to the problem of estrangement as almost an epidemic level problem. That's how common it is. So Joshua Coleman is probably the most frequently cited authority on parental estrangement today. He's written a couple of books about it, many articles, and he states that in his research, move this window here so I can actually see. I can't see my slide, Eric. Can you help me with that?
I can read it for you.
Okay, thank you. If you don't mind, thanks.
Okay, it says, my research and my clinical work over the past 4 decades has shown me that you can be a conscientious parent and your kid may still want nothing to do with you when they're older. Wow.
Okay, yeah. So let's talk about who parental estrangement impacts. Obviously, top of the list would be the parents. And it has a far greater impact, I think, than people realize. We have a personal friend now as a result of this, Faye Avis, who has specialized in parental estrangement over the past, I don't know, a couple of decades, I guess, now. And so he works with parents of estranged adult kids quite a bit. And he's noted that the vast majority of parents who are estranged from their children have the same symptoms as someone who's suffering from PTSD. Nightmares, flashbacks, insomnia, compromised cognition and memory, rumination, replaying those conversations with your kids over and over in your mind, depression and anxiety, guilt, gastrointestinal maladies, headaches, skeletal issues, skin disorders, arrhythmias, all kinds of physical manifestations, in addition to the negative relational and spiritual effects that can accumulate as a result of the stress. So because of this, it's important to focus on the parents themselves. And toward the end of my talk, that's really what I want to get to, is how we can help parents, whether we're parents ourselves of estranged adult kids trying to heal, or whether we know someone who is trying to heal from an estrangement. One of the ways that it impacts parents is the majority of parents of estranged adult kids are actually in their elder years, 60s, 70s, 80s. And statistically, 1 in 5 older adults in the US is an elder orphan. That is, they have no one to turn to in time of need. So this parental trauma is a result of the grief of loss. It's as if your children have died, and yet you know they're still out there somewhere, and you worry about their well-being. And the grief of loss is also compounded by the rejection and the lack of closure. You know, we have social systems in place to deal with the grief that comes with loss through death. We have funerals, we take meals over. Those social systems are not in place for a loss like this, especially considering the reluctance of most parents to even disclose that they are estranged from their children. And of course, there's the uncertainty for the parent's future. Parents who are suffering from estrangement may be uncertain of what will happen to them as they age. Will anyone care for them? Will anyone be there when they die? And then, of course, you have the collateral and multi-generational losses that go along with estrangement. Many parents of estranged adult children have also lost grandchildren as a result of the estrangement. Marilyn, would you mind reading that next quote by Joshua Coleman?
Sure. Thousands of grandparents today have been cut off from contact with their grandchildren. While this sometimes results from the grandparent's highly problematic behavior toward the grandchild, my clinical experience reveals that grandchildren are often a casualty of the conflict between parents and grandparents. And I have to say, it happened to me for a few months, and I cried almost every day. It's a terrible experience.
It's a terrible experience. And thank you for mentioning that. I actually did cry every night. I would wake up in the middle of the night crying for well over a year, probably close to 2 years. So you also have sleep being impacted by all of this as well. But you have loss of connection on a multi-generational basis. You have a loss of shared history and even a loss of resources. Grandparents provide for their grandchildren a sense of identity and family legacy. So the grandchildren are being impacted by this loss as well. Grandparents also provide a positive influence in most cases and a broader perspective that comes with age, as well as an emotional support that differs from the role of parents. And I think one thing that a lot of people don't talk about is how this negatively impacts the adult children as well. The adult children, even though they're most often the ones estranging, 95% of estrangements are initiated by the adult children, not by the parents. And many of those estrangements are unfortunately being encouraged by people in the mental health profession who don't value the connection between adult children and their parents. And they encourage this in spite of the fact, excuse me, that there is no research to indicate that the adult children benefit from the cutoff. So they're promoting something that there's no evidence to support the benefit of. There are, oh, this is more information about the grandchild and grandparent ties. I just want to point out that it's not just the grandchildren that benefit from the connection. Grandparents who are actively involved in their grandchildren's lives actually live longer lives and have a reduced risk of depression. So let's talk about the categories of estrangement. People always want to know, well, what causes it? And I've found that it's not generally helpful to talk about the causes because it's such a broad spectrum and often complicated and an interwoven web of reasons. But you can basically break down the reasons that lead to estrangement into 4 categories. You have hardwired problems, that is, some difficult to solve issue within you or your child, which plays a large factor in the estrangement. Excuse me. One of those hardwired issues may be a family history of estrangement. Excuse me, in my case, there is a strong family history of estrangement. My grandfather, my mother's father, had an estranged relationship with his parents, and it's not clear to me who was the initiator, who was at fault, or what the issues were. We just know that that was a factor. In addition to that, my own mother has cut me off multiple times through the years. So there's this hardwired tendency to deal with conflict by cutting off the other person. And that's just one possibility of hardwired. Another possibility is, another category rather, is therapeutic and developmental. That is anxiety or depression or some kind of a mental health issue that could play a significant role in the estrangement. You also have situational factors. For example, you might have a child that goes off to college and they're experiencing freedom for the first time in a new way. And so they're just not contacting the parents like they used to. Or you might have a young man that comes back from war and is dealing with his own issues, or is stationed somewhere else and isn't keeping in touch with the family. So those would be situational issues. But the most common, and I would say by far the most common category of estrangement, is leveraged estrangements. that is a third party or more than one third party is encouraging the child to estrange from the parents. And as I mentioned earlier, this might be a therapist, or one common scenario is in the case of divorces, where one of the parents is creating a parental alienation by turning the child against the other parent. It could be another sibling of the child, or it could be a friend or some other family member that's encouraging the estrangement. And oftentimes, something we're seeing more and more commonly now is, and this is not to disparage daughters-in-law, there are lots of good daughters-in-law out there, but there seems to be a trend of daughters-in-law who have an insecurity and need to sort of stake their territory with the son that they've married by creating distance between the son and the family. That's another common issue. All right, so the people that need to be educated about parental estrangement include churches, chaplains, ministry leaders, medical care providers. As I mentioned earlier, you can have physical symptoms that manifest as a result of the estrangement. And if a medical care provider is not aware of the estrangement and is especially not aware of how to deal with an estrangement when it affects their patient, that can impact the medical care of the patient. I know in my own case, I was having arrhythmias, I was having severe insomnia, I was having skin rashes. Almost everything on that medical list that I read earlier was manifesting physically for me. And when I would go see my doctors, I recognized that the stress was a factor and I would bring it up. And I noticed that in most cases, with one exception, my doctors really didn't know what to do with the situation and oftentimes would just gloss over it and change the subject. Fortunately, my primary care physician did respond with empathy and take into consideration the fact that that stressor was a major player in my health problems. But you can see how that would be important for medical care providers to be informed. Also, senior and retirement centers, and of course, mental health providers and mental health supporters, such as coaches. Okay, so when it comes to disclosing, one of the reasons parents choose not to disclose in many cases is because when they do disclose, as I said earlier, they get either people don't know what to do with the estrangement, or they'll often give advice like you might give someone who's dealing with a normal conflict. You just need to be more forgiving, or you just need to write a letter of amends to your child, or send your child gifts, or tell your child that you love them. And we've found the research shows that these things actually don't help in most cases in the estrangement. When a child chooses to estrange, especially if they specifically state that they want no contact with the parent, doing these things can actually exacerbate the problem. It can actually cause the child to feel that their boundaries are not being respected. And in some cases, it can create in the child a sense of empowerment that can create sort of this blood in the water type of situation where the child actually becomes more hostile and more aggressive toward the parent, and in some cases abusive toward the parent, either emotionally, verbally, or sometimes even physically. So these sorts of things don't help. Why don't they help? Well, I think this part of the research that trying trying to remember. It was, help me, the university in England that starts with a C.
Cambridge.
Cambridge, thank you. It was Cambridge who did a study on estrangement. And theirs was also a survey. And they asked this question. Marilyn, would you read that question on that slide?
Yes, we could never have a functional relationship in the future.
So
70,
they asked,
go ahead.
go ahead.
Oh, 70 to 80% of estranged adult children agreed or strongly agreed that they couldn't have a functional relationship. Less than 15% of estranged parents agreed or strongly agreed. So the parents did not agree.
Yeah. So you can see there's this volition on the part of the parents to heal the relationship, while 70 to 80% of the estranged adult children either agreed or strongly agreed with the statement that we could never have a functional relationship in the future. Now, Joshua Coleman, when he did his research on estrangements, sorry, not Joshua Coleman, but Karl Pillemer, the Cornell Reconciliation Project, they actually looked at families who were able to reconcile. And the number one factor in the reconciliation was a willingness to take these perspectives. You know, the parent has one perspective, the child has another perspective of what's happened in the past. To take these perspectives and set them aside, recognizing that you may not be able to reconcile these two perspectives of what has gone wrong in the relationship. The successful reconciliations were willing to set those perspectives aside, set their own narratives aside, and work on rebuilding the relationship from this point forward, building trust, building relationship. So you can see that if you have 70 to 80% of the adult children who are not willing to do that, how difficult reconciliation would be. And this is just a quote from that Cambridge study. One of the parents, Marilyn, would you mind reading that, please?
People think if your own kids hate you that much, there must be something wrong with you. Now, if the question comes up, I say, I have a son and a daughter, and I don't see them nearly enough. I try to avoid any more discussion. Before, if I said anything about my kids not talking to me or that I don't see my grandkids, it usually killed the conversation.
So you can see why parents would be reluctant to to disclose that they're not reconciled with their children. And we've talked about some of the things that don't work when it comes to parental alienation or parental estrangement. Let's now talk about some of the things that can be helpful. This is an acronym that our friend Faye came up with, REACH for support. Reveal the estrangement. So if parents are reluctant to disclose, that's your first obstacle right there. How can we help parents disclose? And how can we as parents be willing to disclose? One of the things that you can do is look for behaviors that may indicate that a parent is dealing with estrangement. Some of those behaviors might include withdrawal, loss of interest in pleasurable activities, change in eating habits, talking about one adult child to the exclusion of the others. So if you have an adult or a parent that has 3 adult children and the parent is only talking about 2 of those children, that's probably a pretty good indicator that they're estranged from one of those children. Avoidance of conversations about adult children. This would be me. I just tend to avoid talking about children at all. And that tends to be one of the first things that people ask you when they meet you. You know, we ask, oh, do you have any children? Right up there next to, what do you do for a living? And so if you answer yes, then they ask questions about your adult children. So I have had to come up with a solution for this. I very quickly say, yes, we have 4 adult children and they're scattered across the country. So they're all grown up and they've moved on. And I changed the subject. So if you find that you know an adult who is exhibiting these kinds of behaviors, there are some questions that you can ask to probe that might help them to be willing to open up. And the questions have to be asked gently because it's such a sensitive topic. But you can ask, sorry, I'm looking for my notes here. I'm sorry, I've lost my place on that. So I'm just going to move on to the next issue and we'll circle back around to that since we're running out of time. We want to explore the impacts of estrangement. We've talked about some of those earlier. So some of the things that I shared earlier are things that you can share with the parent of the estranged adult children, that you understand that there can be physiological impacts, financial impacts, collateral losses such as grandchildren, that sort of thing. And then we want to address the issue of parental trauma. Recognizing it as a trauma, it is a loss, just as if you had lost your children to death. And you can empathize with the fact that there may not be avenues to deal with that trauma and that loss that society normally has in place to deal with losses. And next, you can cultivate hope that recovery is possible. And the reason I have recovery underlined here is because it's difficult to cultivate hope that reconciliation is possible. Reconciliation may seem impossible to the parent at that point in time for some of the reasons I shared earlier. So what we can do is focus on recovery. That is helping the parent to cultivate other relationships, to cultivate new purpose in life, to cultivate avenues of social connection outside of family, outside of adult children, those sorts of things. And finally, you can help the parent to find recovery resources. And I have some of those here with me. I've mentioned a couple of these. Karl Pillemer's book, Fault Lines, and that is his research project, the Cornell Reconciliation Project. And then Joshua Coleman has written Rules of Estrangement. And then this book, Peak, Parents of Estranged Adult Kids. The author of this book lives here locally in my area in Hendersonville, North Carolina. And we've gotten to know him, and he runs support groups for parents of estranged adult kids. He has a history with Alcoholics Anonymous because his son was an addict. And so he's taken the format of Alcoholics Anonymous and applied it to these support groups that he does for parents of estranged adult kids. I'm not crazy about the fact that he doesn't use Jesus Christ as the foundation for the support groups. He prefers to do it like Alcoholics Anonymous, where you just have a spiritual source that you refer to. So some of the things in his book border on discomfort for me, but as far as the research and the relationship aspect and helping parents heal, this is an invaluable resource. It's an excellent resource. In fact, much of what I've shared this evening comes from that resource. So I'm open to questions now. I know we're right at time.
Okay, so what we're going to do is have a closing prayer, and Nicole offered to do that, and then we'll close the recording and we'll have discussion time. So I know there'll be a lot to discuss. So thank you, Nicole. Before we begin discussion, would you pray, please?
Yes. Can you hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Our loving Creator and Redeemer, thank you so much for giving us the knowledge of you, giving us hope in you to rebuild the broken places, to give us the Sabbath, of course, but to give us this opportunity to learn how to grieve, how to support each other, how to support others in this very challenging time. I ask that each person who has heard these words today, that they are able to be encouraged and that we are able to draw closer to you, closer to each other in our families and our friends. Thank you so much for your love for this Sabbath, and help us to love in such a way that people know that we are your disciples and the work will be done and we can return home